History as it happens, June 8th, 2023. The Plumbers.
5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee.
Burglars forced a stairwell door, then taped its latch open.
According to the investigators' report, Liddy and Hunt left that room when the break-in was discovered.
I had no prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in. At first, the police found nothing. Then they spied 5 men crouching behind some desks.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
But the way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and just say, stay the hell out of this.
Richard Nixon's future as the President of the United States has now apparently moved beyond his control.
What did the President know, and when did he know it?
Former White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman found guilty today on 5 counts in the Watergate cover-up trial.
A president is impeachable if he attempts to subvert the Constitution.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Nixon's henchmen have been brought back to life in an HBO series. It's a comedy, depicting the Watergate break-in as a comedy of errors, orchestrated by G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt. What's with our endless fascination with Watergate? What can the scandal still teach us? That's next with historian Ken Hughes, as we talk about the White House Plumbers, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
You should have seen this guy operate. Gets the cleaning lady to let us in. Ergo, 100% legal. And they can ideas.
Oh yeah, good luck with that. And the best part, when she leaves at night.
Oh yeah, she doesn't even lock the back door.
Slip in, get into the filing cabinet, slip out.
I think it makes a lot of sense to tell the story of Watergate through the break-in, because it's the most dramatic part, it is the clearest part, it's got enough complication in it to be interesting. It does show at an extreme what Nixon's approach to the presidency and to politics could do.
Does art imitate life, or have our lives become so absurd that even the finest art could not effectively portray the absurdity? If you were to watch, say, a TV show where the President of the United States eggs on a mob to attack Congress to try to stop it from certifying the election, and then he goes back to the White House so he can watch coverage of the riot on TV, and then 2 years later, he's still the most popular Republican politician in the country who might win the White House again? We might find such a story too far-fetched, but it wouldn't be fiction. We're living this reality in America today. Same might be said of the Watergate scandal. A half-century later, it's still hard to believe that certain parts of it really happened. But the truth is indeed stranger than fiction. President Nixon had his own personal police force, whose job it was to destroy the Democrats prior to the 1972 election. Nixon's Special Investigations Unit, the Plumbers, because they stopped leaks.
Plumbers? They fix leaks.
Oh, I think everybody prefers Odessa.
No. Plumbers is better. Very clever.
The guys who broke into the DNC headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, they're the subject of a limited series on HBO, White House Plumbers. And we thank HBO for permission to use clips of the show in this episode. Woody Harrelson plays E. Howard Hunt. Justin Theroux plays G. Gordon Liddy. Here they are on a plane talking about their covert plans.
Now, I appreciate that you take chances. Yes, we've gotten results, but I can't have any fuck-ups. Capiche? It's too important.
Now, you listen to me, George. You are not a federal agent anymore. You are an intelligence agent. You are a spy. And if you want to succeed in this line of work, you need to be willing to bend the rules, color outside the line.
Well, they did bend the rules, and their performances were excellent. But were they accurate? Researcher and historian Ken Hughes of the University of Virginia, the author of 2 books about Nixon's criminality, Chasing Shadows and Fatal Politics, an expert on secret presidential recordings, will be here in a moment to talk about the show and the relevant history, among other things. Watergate wasn't funny, but comedy, satire is often better than drama at conveying a serious message. Nixon wound up crushing George McGovern in a historic landslide in 1972. Did he really need to have people like G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt bumbling on his behalf, committing felonies to help him win a second term? Less than a week after the break-in, the FBI discovered a check in the bank account of one of the Watergate burglars. The check was written to the Nixon campaign, meaning money for his re-election bid was being used instead to pay the burglars. This problem is what H.R. Haldeman talked to Nixon about on the Smoking Gun tape. As Nixon agrees to the plan to tell the FBI to stop investigating the break-in, the cover-up of the crime, he starts asking Haldeman who among his inner circle knew about the break-in or how it would be handled. And he says, well, who is the asshole who did it? Is it Liddy? He must be a little nuts.
Well, who is the asshole that did it? I said, is it Liddy? Is that the fellow? He must be a little nuts. Yeah. I mean, he just isn't well screwed on, is he? Isn't that a problem? No, he was under pressure, apparently, to get more information, and as he got more pressure, he pushed.
Again, the reality here is so crazy it doesn't need any embellishments. In the House Plumbers, Liddy is kinda nuts. A true believer in Nixon, a hater of the communists, the left, the people who want to destroy the country. Instead, he helped destroy Nixon's presidency.
Textbook black op. I'm going to run your black bag op by Ehrlichman, but I think he is going to like it.
Ken Hughes, welcome to the Washington Times.
Thank you for inviting me, Martin. It's a great pleasure for me to be here.
You survived the Indianapolis 500 on New York Avenue Northeast.
It was an adventure, but it is happily ended here.
Yeah, for those of you listening who do not know what I'm talking about, be grateful you don't have to take that highway ever. You know, before we get to the Plumbers, I just want to ask you a little bit about the work you do as a historian, as a master of the audio tapes. Bob Woodward called you one of America's foremost experts on secret presidential recordings. What attracted you to this field?
I'm going to say greed for certainty. The biggest obstacle to studying history is that we usually have to depend on people's memories and honesty. Neither of those things is fully reliable. The ideal way to study history would be to have a time machine that could just take you back so you could observe and hear what was going on. And the Nixon tapes are the closest history has ever come to that, because Nixon had a voice-activated system in the White House for 2.5 of the most interesting years in American history.
It's difficult listening, too, because it is on a speakerphone. Not all the dialogue is very clear from an audio perspective, and probably a lot of it is just mundane talk. So you've got to listen to, hours upon hours, weeks, days, months, years to find the good stuff.
To find the gold. And that's true. But that also makes you, as an historian, more sure that you've given the complete record as thorough a review as it's humanly possible to do.
And you've done the LBJ tapes, the Nixon tapes, and now you're on to the Kennedy tapes.
Yes. This year we're going to come out with a collection of Kennedy tapes from JFK's very last crisis, which was the coup in Vietnam, right before his own assassination. The president of South Vietnam was assassinated in an American-backed coup. And this is an opportunity. These tapes provide us with this very rare opportunity to listen in as a president oversees and manages a covert operation during basically the final months of his life.
Ngo Dien Diem was the South Vietnamese autocrat. He was a staunch Catholic, anti-communist. Kennedy did not give the order, right? It's more complicated than that.
Yeah, the short of it is that Kennedy had the opportunity to rule out assassination, but he didn't take it. He wound up taking no position on that at all. And he did give a green light to the coup plotters another long story short, the U.S. government had the power to decide who ran South Vietnam because we paid for the majority of the South Vietnamese government's budget. They couldn't shift governments without our approval. And in October of '63, CIA in Saigon was approached by a cabal of South Vietnamese generals who asked the U.S. position on a coup, said, we need you not to thwart it, but we don't need you to participate in it. And they said among their plans were to kill Diem's brother, No Dinh Nhu. The embassy called him Bobby. He was the second most powerful person in South Vietnam.
And his wife was also kind of a nut.
Madame Nhu. Yeah. Incredibly colorful figure, a precursor of the modern right-wing glamorous female provocateur. Kennedy gave the green light without taking any position on assassination at all.
All right, we'll return. You said that's coming out soon.
Later this year.
All right, we'll have you back. We'll discuss that. One more question about the tapes, your expertise in the tapes, before we start talking about what I invited you to come here to discuss. They don't tell the whole story, right? I mean, you could, of course, write a book about the tapes themselves, but they complement the existing documentary record. Isn't that the best way to use them?
Yes, that is the best way to use them. The great thing about being an historian of mid-century America is that it's the age of paper. Things are typed and there are carbon copies, cables, all messages going back and forth between the U.S. government and a foreign locale like Saigon.
Yeah, future historians are going to be sifting through text messages
yes,
to write the story.
To the extent they haven't been deleted.
Yes, right, which you're not supposed to do. So, Ken Hughes, master of the Watergate tapes, what did you think of the HBO series, The White House Plumbers?
I liked it. Surprisingly, for an historian, I watch these series for entertainment. I think it's fun. I don't expect a TV series to be any more historically accurate than a Shakespeare play. I want to see what they reveal about characters and about drama and basically about, the perspective of the filmmaker.
Yeah, right. So, there's more than one way to tell a story to get a message across.
Yes. Right. I mean, I was particularly excited to see Woody Harrelson play E. Howard Hunt because he's a terrific actor, and Hunt is a terrific character. So,
well, there's an emotional or an emotive power to film that you won't find in an academic history book. I think you can do both. However, we'll get into some of these issues that are raised by portraying Watergate comedically. Well, first, let me ask you that. What did you think of that? I mean, I think Dr. Strangelove, had it been a serious movie about nuclear war, would not have been effective. How about Watergate as a comedy?
Enough time has passed so that if we treat aspects of the Watergate scandal as comedy, it works. The movie Dick, the TV series Gaslit.
Dick was a 1990s film.
Yes, and now The White House Plumbers. They all work because Watergate is now kind of comfort food. We're in a particularly tumultuous time politically. Not as bad as we've been. It's certainly not as bad as the late 60s or the early 70s. But there's just a lot of anxiety about the future of American democracy, about the health of American democracy and the health of our normal politics.
So then why is Watergate comfort food? Because it's not an escape then, right? Some people watch TV to escape reality.
Well, I think of it as comfort food because the Watergate burglary has a beginning, with a very clear crime. It's got a middle with the hunt for the criminals and the cover-up. And then finally, the truth about at least that part of the scandal comes to light and people are convicted and go to prison for it. So it's kind of like Law and Order. You know the story is going to end. You know how the story is going to end. So people can look back on that as a time when the system did, to a degree, work.
Neither you or I is a culture critic, a movie critic, TV critic, but I think that's what anyone can be.
Yeah.
Right? That's what makes watching these shows fun. You can talk about them afterward. I think a lot of political art can be pretty bad, or art about partisan politics, right? Especially if it gets preachy. But I think all art is political, isn't it?
A lot of art is political, and some of my favorite art is political. I mean, I'm thinking of some of my favorite music. Stuff done by U2 or some of Bob Dylan's work. It's both political and artistic because politics is part of life.
So that's not a problem, doing political art. Maybe if the show strays too far from the facts, right? So you're a historian, you're watching historical shows or movies, and there are a lot of them now. There's a new series about Anne Frank on that I've been watching. There's another series about Beirut in the early 1980s during the Reagan administration. And you touched on this earlier. I mean, do you hold, as a historian, producers, directors accountable if they're inaccurate? I guess it depends on the inaccuracy, right?
It does. I hadn't watched the complete series. I watched the first and the second and the fifth episode, and then you told me we were going to discuss it. I watched the third and the fourth last night. The part where they have Dorothy Hunt on the plane giving an expose to a reporter right before the plane crashes, I thought, that just didn't happen.
Who knows what they talked about on that plane ride, right?
Right? Even if they saw each other.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, the idea that there is a big conspiracy behind the bumbling conspiracy. Both my books really could be considered to be about conspiracies, especially, Chasing Shadows, which deals with the origins of Watergate. Conspiracies are sweaty, furtive, bumbling, imperfect things. Richard Nixon had a hard time getting his aides to put together the plumbers, and he was president of the United States. Getting a conspiracy going and making it work is hard. What I didn't like about the White House plumbers was the idea that, there was the omniscient, omnipotent conspiracy behind the Kennedy assassination. And it's like,
yeah, they kept hinting that the plumbers knew about that or may have been involved in it.
Yeah.
I actually didn't pick up on that very well. I didn't really know exactly what they were trying to get at there.
Hunt shows up in some conspiracy theories.
Oh, okay, I see.
Everybody shows up in those conspiracy theories eventually.
Right. Conspiracy theories are, in a way, impossible to disprove because when you bring up facts that poke holes in it, well, that's just part of the conspiracy.
Right.
On the subject of responsibility of the producers, the directors, to be accurate, I think this show does admit that they take some liberties with the facts.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they get the overall story kind of right, that these plumbers were bumblers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the comedic elements are there, and they're not presenting the show as a documentary. I think that's good. I think we know that if we really want to get the truth, we're going to have to read some books.
Yeah, exactly. People shouldn't get their history from just the show. I'm going to sound like a grumpy old man, grumpy middle-aged old man here.
We'll sound like too grumpy.
Yeah. Watch the shows, but then, yes, go ahead and read some real scholarship about these subjects. I think if shows can introduce people to a subject, that's great, but just don't take what's in the movie. And, we do know that movies. I just did an episode about D-Day with Cathal Nolan, a terrific military historian. We know how depictions of World War II influence our cultural memory, right? Hero movies like Saving Private Ryan. It's no small thing. What about the choice of telling the Watergate scandal through the experiences of these plumbers, who were, of course, important, but not the most important people?
I'll give the amateur drama critic answer first, and then my particular historian answer. I think it makes a lot of sense to tell the story of Watergate through the break-in, because it's the most dramatic part. It is the clearest part. It's got enough complication in it to be interesting. It does show at an extreme what Nixon's approach to the presidency and to politics could do. But turning to the historian now, it misses what is for me the most interesting part about Watergate, and that's Nixon's conception of politics and the presidency as a weapon to kind of recreate America in a Republican image. Nixon really saw himself as the Republican Franklin Roosevelt, the guy who shatters the New Deal coalition and replaces it with the new Republican majority. Both my books are kind of about that, especially the second one, Fatal Politics, because Nixon played the politics of the war so masterfully and was just so skilled at blaming all his opponents for the consequences of his own policies. The ultimate defeat in Vietnam was built into the way Nixon ended the war. And he knew it was coming, but he did manage to blame the left, the Democrats, the news media.
And those are people he went after, too.
Yeah.
Well, Watergate is the name of a building, right? So we say as part of Watergate. No, it was part of his, as you say, his approach to politics.
Yes.
Having his own special police force operating out of the White House.
Yes,
right?
yes.
We're going to get into some of those details that sometimes get obscured, but I'll just share with listeners what you say in the introduction to your superb book about the Chenault affair, Chasing Shadows. You write here, many factors contributed to Nixon's fall, far more than I can fit in these pages. Wand-waving accounts that reduce the complexity of Nixon's downfall to a single cause are the preserve of Watergate revisionists. You say from time to time a new theory emerges, placing the blame for Nixon's undoing on the scheming of a scapegoat like John Dean. But you say Dean was a key figure in the cover-up, but not the central one. That was Nixon. The notion that the president was the victim of a criminal conspiracy rather than the perpetrator of it cannot survive the tape-recorded sounds of him calling the shots from the Oval Office. You know, about the show, the tapes don't ever show up in the show. Nixon doesn't show up in the show except in news clips. Were you disappointed that there was no tape audio in there?
I have this fantasy that one day HBO or some similarly prestigious organization will do a series about Watergate from Nixon's perspective. I would love that because, you know, there's just so much more. And it's simultaneously more disturbing, but it also makes things make much more sense. I mean, like, the only excuse for writing another book about Watergate is that you're going to tell somebody something they don't know that will help them understand this big scandal. The reason I did it is that Nixon had a crime to cover up before he even became president.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. You know, your books are original. Whenever I see anything about Watergate, I'm like, another book, movie, show, whatever about Watergate. I mean, is there anything else new to learn? Factual evidence, right? There's always new interpretations. But as you mentioned, it is comfort food. It is endlessly fascinating. I still find myself fascinated about it. But there's also another issue that we discussed last week when we were arranging to have you come in here. A lot of people don't know any of this stuff. There are younger people, and whenever I start a sentence, when I speak to younger people, it is kind of a reminder that I'm on the wrong side of 40. But it's true. I meet younger people all the time who have an interest in history, who have no living memory of the Soviet Union and don't understand its significance.
Yes.
So to Watergate, yeah, that's something I heard that was a really big deal, but it's not front of mind. And we know we're still living with the consequences of executive overreach today. That was more of a word salad than a question, but why don't you address that issue about the need to, well, educate every new generation that comes along? We have to revisit these subjects.
I think Watergate is something we do have to revisit. I also try not to be too judgmental about people not knowing my favorite parts of history, because there is so much of history that I don't know. And every historian, you know, no matter how learned, really only winds up knowing certain segments of history. It's perfectly all right for people to not learn the parts of history that don't seem relevant to their lives, but Watergate is just really relevant to our lives because Nixon weaponized the federal government for political purposes. And that is the biggest overall theme of his presidency.
Yeah, it wasn't just about a third-rate burglary, to borrow the
Yes.
words of his press spokesman who called it that. So the Plumbers themselves are never heard on the tapes, but how often do you actually hear Nixon, Ehrlichman, Haldeman talking about these guys?
It's funny that this is one of the most interesting things about the tapes. When Nixon put together the Plumbers, it was to commit a burglary. He wanted to burglarize the Brookings Institution.
Okay, we'll get to that now. Yeah, go ahead.
It was difficult for him to get his own aides to do this because he was telling them to organize a crime.
Yes, and they're all listening to him, right? Well, I think it was Kissinger said, well, maybe we can't do that. But yeah,
Kissinger goes, can't we just send a guy over to the Brookings Institution and see if they've got the classified files?
Yeah, they wanted what they thought would be classified files because of the Pentagon Papers made Nixon more paranoid about leaks, so they believed there was some classified info at the Brookings Institution.
Classified information that could have exposed the worst thing Richard Nixon did in the 1968 campaign, which was to secretly sabotage the Vietnam peace talks right before the election.
Right, the Chenault affair.
The Chenault affair.
So on the tapes, and I'm reading right from Chasing Shadows here, page 2, and I actually found this audio online. I maybe even used it at some point. I'm going to find it again. I want it implemented on a thievery basis. That's my not very good Richard Nixon.
Better than mine.
Yeah, on a thievery basis. God damn it, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get it.
But couldn't we go over, now Brookings has no right to have classified that?
You know, I want it implemented on a thievery basis. God damn it, get in and get those files. Blow the safe and get it.
So why didn't they ever manage to blow up the Brookings Institution, or at least the safe inside the Brookings Institution?
A few reasons. The first is that even though Nixon's inner circle was in the habit of agreeing with him, none of them thought this was a good idea. The reason Nixon gave them to do it was just very weak. He said, well, we can get blackmail information to use against Lyndon Johnson.
Who's already out of office.
And all he wants him to do is denounce the leak of the Pentagon Papers, which would be at most this one-day story. But the real reason Nixon wanted it, he doesn't say this on tape, but it's the only logical reason, is that he knew that Johnson had some information about what he had done to get the South Vietnamese to boycott the Paris peace talks right before the election.
The Chenault affair.
The Chenault affair. And he was worried that the guys who had conducted the Pentagon Papers studies, Morton Halperin, Leslie Galvin, Paul Warnke, who are all part of ISA within the Department of Defense during the Johnson administration, Nixon thought that they had put together a study on all the events leading up to the bombing halt. If there was any report that would include Nixon's wrongdoing in the 68 campaign, it would be that report. Thing is, that report didn't exist.
Because Johnson knew Nixon had been doing this. Actually, there are tapes of Johnson referring to this, but he didn't want to go public before an election. It would be like almost interfering in an election, right?
Or some of our folks, including some of the old China lobby, are going to the Vietnamese embassy and saying, please notify the president that if he'll hold out till November the 2nd, they could get a better deal. Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign. That's right. And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. My judgment is that Nixon ought to play it just like he has all along. That I want to see peace come the first day we can. That it's not going to affect the election one way or the other. The conference is not even going to be held until after the election. They have stopped shelling the cities. They have stopped going across the DMZ. We've had 24 hours of relative peace. Now, if Nixon keeps the South Vietnamese away from the conference, well, that's going to be his responsibility.
Johnson got his best information through clandestine sources. The CIA was bugging the office of South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu. The NSA was intercepting cables from the South Vietnamese embassy here in D.C. to the Saigon government. And then Johnson had the FBI tap the South Vietnamese embassy's phone and trail Anna Chenault and tell him everybody who entered and exited from the embassy. There was a chance the day before the election for him to go public. The Christian Science Monitor came up with a really good story, saying that the Johnson administration knew that Nixon had been secretly undermining these peace talks. They came to the White House, and Johnson gets on the phone with two hawks, Secretary of State Dean Rusk and National Security Advisor Walt Rostow. These are guys considered the architects of the Vietnam War. And one dove, Defense Secretary Clark Clifford. And he says, what should I do? And they all say, they are unanimous, you can't use this information.
Looking back on it now, had Johnson spilled the beans about this, we might have been saved from Richard Nixon.
I frankly, in retrospect, wish he had. I mean, if we could foresee everything that was going to happen, Johnson would have done it. And I think he wanted to at that point.
Yeah. He didn't really like Nixon.
He didn't really like Nixon.
Who did?
There was the problem of the clandestine sources. And the second problem was that he didn't have the goods on Nixon himself. He knew that Anna Chenault was speaking in Nixon's name, but he didn't have direct intelligence on what Nixon was saying to Chenault.
And the bombing was halted about a week before the election, but the peace talks fell apart, and they may have fallen apart anyway. It's unfair to say that Nixon kept the Vietnam War going because of this situation, in my view, because they were far away from a peace deal.
Right. There was no plausible settlement at that point.
But the point is, Nixon was not a public official at that point. He was a civilian running for office at that point. He was not in an official capacity messing around. So.
Right, and he was violating the Logan Act, which, though rarely enforced, does prohibit U.S. citizens from interfering with presidential negotiations. And it's a difficult law, but it's a necessary one just for things like what Nixon was doing.
And G. Gordon Liddy, we'll start talking about the Plumbers again. G. Gordon Liddy had an idea of burning down the Brookings Institution and then showing up dressed as firefighters to make it look like they were there to put out a fire, and then they'd go in and look for the files. Is that right?
The idea was not to kill people. They were going to do it after hours and hopefully avoid any casualties that way. I'm saying hopefully and laughing because there's no real way you can guarantee that. Liddy came up with this elaborate plan to use a fire truck and to have the CIA assets, people who used to work for the CIA, dress up as firemen, go in and steal the safe where this alleged report on the bombing halt was supposed to be held. And they presented that to the White House, and the answer came back that was just too expensive.
Yeah, I guess buying a fire truck is... Although they wound up spending so much money to keep these guys afloat after the Watergate break-in and the arrests. We'll get to that in a moment. So, yeah, G. Gordon Liddy, he is depicted in the HBO series, The White House Plumbers, as pretty much a psychopath. Did you believe that's... And again, this was comedic, right? How did you feel about the way Liddy is portrayed?
I thought the actor did a great job.
Justin Theroux.
Yeah.
He was terrific. He looked just like him.
Looked just like him, did the voice well, but I didn't like... I think he made Liddy look too bumbling. Liddy was a fanatic, but not, that far out within the right wing of the Republican Party at the time.
Fanatic about?
Fanatic against the left. They do go into his, fascination with Nazi imagery and
Well, he played a record of Hitler's speeches over dinner.
Yeah, he's certainly a disturbing fellow. But he had run for Congress and had done a creditable job. He had lost. He had worked for the FBI. He, I think, did some work for the Justice Department. They say when he went to work for the committee to reelect the president as the counsel for the finance section, he did a very responsible and good job. I mean, he didn't tell anybody to break any laws.
He was an attorney, as you say. And he gives in the show a presentation to Mitchell, who was the Attorney General of the United States, then went to run the re-election campaign, which has the acronym CREEP.
Yes.
Very apt. And that is true. Committee to Re-elect the President. And he gives a presentation, Liddy does, with all of these schemes that had code names, schemes to, destroy Nixon's enemies. Is that true? Did he have all these different schemes?
He did. The gemstone presentation is close to 100% accurate.
Wow.
Getting a houseboat, hiring prostitutes to seduce Democratic politicians, tape recording the results. That was all part of the original scheme, and that wasn't all there was to it. I mean, there was also backing Shirley
Chisholm. Yeah, she ran for president.
Presidential campaign to split the Democrats. As part of it, the Opal plans to do some break-ins and buggings to get political intelligence, which was originally what they wanted Liddy to do in the campaign. Nixon, this is on tape, he was eager to use wiretaps and tailing people, surveillance, in order to get political intelligence on the Democrats.
Yeah, so the debate over whether Nixon ordered the Watergate break-in misses the point.
I think so.
I mean, all of this was his idea. Even if he wasn't approving each and every move, he creates a situation or an atmosphere where, I said it before, he has his own private police force operating out of the White House. And you agree with me that Nixon wasn't directing each and every step here, but
right.
Gave these guys a lot of leeway through Dean and Mitchell and the others.
Nixon, to protect himself, didn't know the details of operations, like the Fielding break-in, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. You can tell from the tapes that Nixon didn't know about that in advance, and Ehrlichman didn't give him... He gave him just the barest summary after it took place. Something happened, it was not good, and we're not going to tell you more.
Yeah, breaking into Ellsberg's, his shrink's office so they can take Ellsberg's psychiatric records to destroy him publicly.
To destroy him, and to Nixon was still working his theory that Ellsberg was part of a conspiracy of Jews, intellectuals, and Ivy Leaguers. So he wanted, more information on that.
Nixon's a nasty guy on these tapes often, isn't he?
He is. He's fascinating because he is capable of performing as a really high-level president. I mean, when he does his interviews about the state of the world, he impresses everybody. He's far-seeing, he's super well-informed, he's done all his homework, he has thought of all the angles.
He's one of the most qualified, or I should say, I shouldn't say qualified. Experienced, yes, men ever to run for office and win the White House.
And he was able to perform competence at this really high level. He's also a creature of prejudice. I mean, he's a creature of lots of prejudices, and he knows better than to state them in public because at the time that would have backfired on him politically. But in private, he has just a whole lot of stereotypes about every conceivable group, but particularly about Jews, intellectuals, and Ivy Leaguers.
Well, he had an insecurity about intellectuals, the Eastern establishment, he called them, right?
Yeah, and
Ivy Leaguers, Harvard, well, the kind of person that he hired. Henry Kissinger.
Right, who is all of the above. Nixon, if you were Jewish, intellectual, or Ivy League and were devoted to Nixon, he thought you were great. He had a very, very different attitude, people within his in-group and people who, he considered other.
Yeah, Nixon cut his teeth in the 1940s as a red baiter.
Yes, he was the one who found a real communist spy.
Yeah, unlike McCarthy, who found basically zero. So back to the Plumbers. E. Howard Hunt, he is portrayed by Woody Harrelson, a veteran actor, very good actor. What did you think of Hunt's depiction in the show? He's kind of a bumbler, down on his luck, former CIA agent, right?
Yeah, I thought Harrelson was great, but I didn't like the script so much because it made him just too buffoonish. This was somebody who did manage to have a few reasonably successful careers. They make a lot about how his spy novels didn't sell and weren't very good, but a lot of people put out a lot of mediocre spy novels.
He was also a family man who, he wasn't all that attentive of a father. His family throughout the whole series, and it's only a 5-episode series on HBO Max, they're begging him to drop this stuff and spend more time with them, but he keeps telling them that his country needs him, right? They're saving the country from the left by doing these rinky-dink break-ins.
Often on the right, there's this great certainty what they're against. A feeling that they're saving civilization from the forces that are going to bring it down.
You notice how much we're talking about Nixon here? Because, he really is the person that this is all about. But as we said, the show chose to, and there's no problem with this, I enjoyed it, focus on the scandal through the eyes and the experiences of the plumbers. The other plumbers have more minor roles in the show, some Cuban exiles, I guess you would call them.
Yes, people who fled Castro's communist revolution.
Try to help breaking into and then McCord, James McCord, who also made a bad, was that true that McCord was the one who screwed up the bugs so they didn't work, so they had to go back and...
The bugs didn't work. I can't really speak to whether McCord did a good job or a bad.
On the issue of whether Nixon ordered any of this, if I'm not mistaken, there's an episode there where I believe it was Jonathan Dean, or one of the other higher tier people in the Nixon administration, telling Hunt and Liddy, you've got to go back and look through a file cabinet because Nixon wants this. So it implies that Nixon actually did order it.
It implies that Nixon wanted some information that could only be found in the DNC. Nixon did want information about Larry O'Brien and about the Democrats, but I haven't seen any good evidence that Nixon knew about any of the break-ins in advance or ordered them.
So the part where I actually laughed out loud is when Hunt and Liddy are in their hotel room at the Watergate, and they're looking across the way. They can see into the windows of the DNC offices, and they see how the plumbers are about to get caught. And they try to get the hell out of there as fast as they can, and they can't unscrew or take a antenna, some type of antenna, some operational technology that they fasten to the balcony at the Watergate Hotel. Did that happen? Do we know if that happened?
I don't know specifically about the antenna, but they did have a very panicked exit from the hotel because, they knew that they had screwed up. They knew they were on the wrong side of the law when When the CIA, messes up overseas, they know they can leave. The CIA will protect them because they're doing CIA business. And, the FBI can get away with stuff because it's the FBI. But these guys were just working for the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon.
But it seems that they didn't really totally separate themselves from their past resumes, right? They were still kind of acting like they were in the FBI and CIA.
Yeah, they thought that they were doing special work. They thought they were saving the country when they worked for the FBI and the CIA, and they still told themselves they were saving the country even when they were undermining an election.
You are not a federal agent anymore. You are an intelligence agent. You are a spy. And if you want to succeed in this line of work, you need to be willing to bend the rules.
How was Watergate misunderstood in the context of too much focus on the break-in?
Thank you for that question. That is certainly designed for me.
Yeah, well, it takes me 38 minutes to get to the good stuff in my interviews. Go ahead.
Well, it's not that the Watergate break-in was unimportant. It was very important. It's just that we've learned so much since then about Nixon's abuses of power as president. There's a lot that happened that would have been even more inflammatory, even more scandalous in 1974 if it had come out. If people had learned about the Chenault affair while Nixon was still president, if they learned that he had sabotaged peace talks right before the election, if they had learned about his decent interval strategy for Vietnam, that he had kept the war going for 4 years because he knew he couldn't win it, and if he lost it before the 72 election, he'd be a one-term president. The bumper sticker at the time for Republicans was "Nobody died at Watergate." Well, a lot of people died because of Richard Nixon's abuses of power.
And that's the subject of your second book, Fatal Politics, The Nixon Tapes, the Vietnam War, and the Casualties of Re-Election. I think our listeners should read both of your books, but go ahead.
20,000 American soldiers died during the 4 years that Nixon prolonged the war. And,
including one of my family members, by the way.
Oh, I'm so
Yeah, my father's cousin, Jimmy Fume, from Jackson Heights, New York. He was, I think, maybe 18 years old. Was killed in the Battle of Hamburger Hill.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. Nixon called his mom, too, to talk to her after she had learned. But, yeah, go ahead. I didn't mean to digress.
I'm glad you said that because it really drives home the importance of what Nixon did, the human impact it had. If Nixon had been honest with the American people in 1969 and said, look, here are our choices. We can stay there forever and keep South Vietnam from falling, but Americans are going to have to fight and die to keep that happening. Or we can leave, but the communists are going to take over. We can get out on the best possible terms, take care of the people who helped us because we owe them. That would have been the moral thing to do, but we should also be realistic about the politics. If Nixon had done that, that would have been...
Yeah, I mean, he was in a sense right about the dilemma he would have faced as a president to lose South Vietnam.
Hubert Humphrey would have attacked him from the right, saying, your decision means that everybody who died in Vietnam died in vain. You just gave up.
The U.S. commitment to Vietnam went all the way back really to, you can say, after FDR's death, and Harry Truman and then Eisenhower supporting the French.
Yes, we started paying for the cost of the war back then.
The French attempt to recolonize Vietnam.
Franklin Roosevelt saw it coming.
Yeah, he did not like colonialism.
He did not like colonialism. He said, we are not fighting World War II so that the British and the French can go reclaim their colonies. And if we don't solve this, then American boys are going to have to go back and solve it again. He said that when he was discussing Indochina, which Vietnam
was part of. And the hated Japanese, who had soldiers left in all of these places, were put into the service of the British and the French, or I should say the British and French in some places, enlisted former Japanese soldiers from World War II to help them put down these national liberation movements.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I believe I learned that in Frederick Logevall's book, Embers of War.
Oh.
I learned it somewhere. Another point about what we miss when we only focus on the break-in. I'm just going to cite a Encyclopedia Britannica article here. It was revealed that as the 1972 campaign season rolled around, roving cells of saboteurs devised ways to weaken individual Democratic presidential campaigns while making it look like the campaigns were actually sabotaging each other. A parallel fascination of the televised Watergate hearings was the questioning of young Nixon aides who left senators incredulous with their explanations that ends justify the means, a morality that had become semi-official White House policy. Another continuing thread was the examination of illegal sources of the money that funded the various clandestine operations. And in the show, they do touch on this. They were sending the Plumbers lots of dough that was supposed to be for Nixon's campaign. Matter of fact, in All the President's Men, this is a major breakthrough when Woodward and Bernstein are investigating. They discovered that a $25,000 check that was supposed to be for Nixon's campaign was essentially laundered to fund this illegal stuff.
Yes, indeed. I can't add much to that. But
I kind of answered my own question. I think I Googled list of the crimes.
Yes.
Well, there's a lot more than burglary. Right?
Yes.
49 people went to prison as a result of Watergate?
Yeah, something like
49,
that.
Yeah.
And I couldn't name all 49 for you, but most of it is for the part of it that's hardest to understand, which is obstruction of justice. A burglary is just so clear. You know, you can put it on camera and show people what was going on. Obstruction of justice is very confusing because you have to bring in all the different agencies involved and talk about how individual pieces of evidence are relevant. And so, you know, that part is...
yeah, it's hard. But there was a tape that clinched it.
Yes.
I watched an interview with Bernstein some years ago where he said it shouldn't have come down to the smoking gun tape. There was already plenty of other information out there that Nixon was a crook.
That is a great point. If you look at his conversation with Dean, he commits obstruction of justice a number of times. I think it's March 21st, the cancer out the heart of the presidency.
And that's why Dean quit, right? Because he was being told to break the law.
Well, yeah, and he was, you know, he got caught.
Yes, that's right.
The fact that I was involved in obstruction of justice, the fact that I assisted another in perjured testimony, the fact that I made personal use of funds that were in my custody. It's far easier to talk about these things myself than to talk about what others did. The president told me I had done a good job, and he appreciated how difficult a task it had been, and the president was pleased that the case had stopped with Liddy.
What happened with the smoking gun tape is that it came out at the right moment politically, when the Republican primaries were behind the members of Congress, and the Republican members of Congress now had to face the general election. And before that point, they were worried about losing their jobs in a primary to people who would blame them for holding Nixon to account. If they didn't back Nixon, their voters wouldn't back them. So they were backing Nixon all the way up until their primaries ended. But they saw this landslide looming against them in the 74 midterm congressional elections. So when a piece of evidence came out that showed Nixon plainly guilty of obstruction of justice, and that was the smoking gun tape, he lost their political support because they knew that sticking by him would mean that moderate voters would vote Democrat and vote them out of office.
Most, but not all. There were still some Republicans who stuck with him to the very, very end.
A few did, yeah.
I mean, the smoking gun tape comes out August 5th, 1974, becomes public in that recording from 1972.
This is a hunt that'll uncover a lot of legal net scandals, a lot of things, and then we just feel that this would be very detrimental to have this thing going any further. This involves these Cubans and Hunt and a lot of hanky-panky that we have nothing to do with ourselves. Well, what the hell, did Mitchell know about this thing then? Was it real? I think so. I don't think he knew the details, but I think he did know how it was he handled it with Auburn and Texas and so forth. Well, who is the asshole that did it then? Is it Liddy? Is that the fellow? He must be a little nuts.
But in that conversation, Nixon is heard approving of a plan from his chief of staff. That was Haldeman or Ehrlichman? Haldeman. H.R. Haldeman. Apparently, to be involved in Watergate, you need to have initials in your name. E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, H.R. Haldeman. To convince the FBI to drop the investigation. I guess they wanted to get the CIA to convince the FBI to stop looking. I mean, long story short, Nixon had been lying all along, and that was the clincher for him. I forgot where I was going with this. Nixon resigns 4 days later. Man, that took a long time to get there, though. I guess we forget how long Watergate took.
Yeah, we do. I was a kid then, so I mainly remember it interfering with my television viewing.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
So let's talk about the impeachment issue now, because today some would say impeachment is being abused or overused. Whenever an official gets into a scandal, it's the first word you hear out of some people's mouths. Let's have an impeachment hearing or whatever. But during Watergate, it took a while for anyone to mention the word impeachment.
Woodward and Bernstein had to put an explainer in one article telling people what impeachment was, because no president had been impeached in a century. It was considered a very drastic and rare tool that was probably, healthy for democracy.
Good. Do you think it's overused now? I guess that's what I should have asked you.
It started during the Clinton era.
Yeah.
He committed a crime, but it was not a high crime or misdemeanor under the Constitution. He committed a petty crime that any citizen should be held accountable for, but it's not the sort of thing that impeachment was designed for. And I think that sort of devalued the currency of impeachment. I do think that Trump's 2 impeachments were justified and did go directly to, his abuses of power as president. That is a constitutional necessity.
So one lesson of Watergate in Vietnam was that the executive had too much power, arrogated too much illegal power to itself in that case. Have we forgotten that lesson? It seems to me that the executive branch still has too much power. I would love for an American president to cede some of that power, but I don't think it's going to happen. Your thoughts on that?
Our Constitution is built around keeping the president, the executive, accountable. Our country was founded on a revolution against an overly strong central executive. So, it's part of our cultural and legal and political tradition to keep presidents within the bounds of the rule of law. That's a difficult thing to do. It got more difficult, as you know, when the presidency's powers expanded during the New Deal and World War II. War seems to be especially problematic for our republic. It creates a lot of excuses for people in power to hide what they're doing and to justify very intrusive things in the lives of Americans by claiming that they are necessary actions to defend national security.
Yeah, the national security reason or excuse covers a lot. I mean, in Vietnam, Nixon was secretly bombing Cambodia with Kissinger. That was one of the articles of impeachment, actually.
Yes, the one was drawn up, and I kind of wish that they had not dropped that one.
But they did go with the War Powers Resolution of 1973, and to my point about trying to rein in excessive executive power when it comes to foreign policy, the War Powers Resolution has pretty much been useless, and it seems that Congress is just more than happy to leave all this stuff to the executive.
Whether it's happy or not, I think it's afraid to interfere. Politicians are very vulnerable to a basic Nixonian attack, which he perfected in the 1950s, which was that you can blame whatever went wrong on your opponent's lack of warrior virtues. He perfected this against Adlai Stevenson, whom he unfairly called Adlai the Appeaser, with his PhD from Dean Acheson's cowardly College of Communist Containment.
Oh, man.
Yeah. I mean, we look back and we think containment won the Cold War. Containment was the best we could do. But bad things kept happening through the Cold War, and Nixon was really good at saying, well, that's because my opponent is weak or lacks courage or doesn't understand the nature of the communist threat.
Yeah, and the Chenault affair was born out of Anna Chenault, the China lobby.
Yes.
Right? And Truman and the Democrats lost China.
Right.
So you cannot be weak on communism.
And that was a great political attack, really effective, because all the rejoinders would make the Democrats look worse. Truman could honestly say, look, no one could have done any better. But that's just reminding the world that he couldn't solve that problem.
All right, so when's your Kennedy stuff coming out?
Our Kennedy transcripts will be coming out later this year. I think October, which
All right.
would be the anniversary of the coup plot, but I'm not so sure about that. And I'm writing my own book about Kennedy, which would come out later, which is going to focus on two of his signature covert operations, Operation Mongoose and the DM coup.
All right, we will have you back to discuss those matters.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Ken Hughes of the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to stay with this theme, history on television. There's an outstanding series on Showtime, Ghosts of Beirut. The events depicted in it are still rippling in our world today. We're going to speak to the filmmaker behind that series. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.